It was a moment that no one could have predicted, and it was the beginning of something that would change the course of history forever. The galaxy had seen many strange and powerful species, but none were as fragile and helpless as the ones who arrived on Earth. Considered the weakest of all species, they had been abandoned by the rest of the universe, left to wither and die on their own war-torn planet. Humanity, though, saw something different in them, an opportunity, a chance to do what others had refused. It all began on a day like any other. An emergency transmission blared across every communication system. Humans thought it was just another distress call, but the message it contained was unlike any they had heard before. "We are the Veraci," the voice crackled through the static, "and we are dying." The words seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The Veraci, an alien race, were known for being physically frail, mentally unstable, and technologically backward. They were the weakest species known to intergalactic space, often mocked by others and pushed to the brink of extinction. No one expected them to survive much longer, let alone send a distress call. The transmission came from a small fleet of ships, battered and broken after fleeing from a devastating war on their home planet. Their only hope was to reach Earth, where rumors spoke of a species that might help them. With no other option, Earth responded, not out of obligation, but out of compassion. A small group of scientists and military officials convened in a secret meeting, deciding that, despite the risks, they would offer refuge to these lost beings. The decision was controversial. The Veraci were seen as nothing more than a burden, a fragile species with no hope of contributing to society. But something about their desperation struck a chord in the human heart. They were weak, yes, but they were also survivors. They deserved a chance. When the Veraci ships landed, the world watched in silence. The beings emerged, looking frail and disoriented. They were small, with translucent skin that seemed to shimmer under the sunlight, and eyes that held an unsettling emptiness, as though they had seen too much loss. Their bodies were weak, barely able to stand, and their movements were slow and unsure. The first humans who encountered them were filled with doubt. How could these fragile beings possibly be of any use? Some of the most skeptical voices questioned whether humanity should even help them, fearing they were too far gone. But one person stood firm in their belief. Dr. Ilara Tain, a human scientist with a reputation for empathy and unconventional thinking, insisted that the Veraci deserved a chance. She was the one who proposed bringing them to Earth, offering them sanctuary and resources to rebuild their society. Despite her doubts and the widespread skepticism around her, she was determined to prove that even the weakest species had something to offer. With great effort, the Veraci were taken to a remote, carefully constructed habitat where they could recover. Earth's resources were invested in their care, and humans worked tirelessly to provide them with shelter, food, and medical assistance. The Veraci began to stabilize physically, but their psychological state was still a challenge. They were broken, their once proud civilization shattered by centuries of war and strife. They had no idea how to rebuild. The questions on every human's mind were simple: what would come of them? Would they rise to the occasion, or would they continue to be a reminder of their species' fragility? As time passed, something unexpected began to happen. The Veraci, though physically weak, were surprisingly resilient in spirit. Their minds, honed by years of survival in a hostile galaxy, were sharper than anyone realized. They began to show signs of extraordinary intelligence, devising systems of communication that far outpaced their technological status. Though their bodies could barely carry them, their minds worked at an incredible pace, absorbing everything humans taught them. But it was not until one fateful day that the first sign of their hidden potential surfaced. In a moment of desperation, one of the Veraci, unable to walk for weeks, suddenly stood up. The room filled with gasps as this fragile being defied the expectations of everyone watching. They moved awkwardly at first, but with each step, their posture grew more confident. Something was happening to them. Something extraordinary. How? Someone whispered. No one knew. But what they did know was this: the Verasai were not as helpless as they appeared. They were more than survivors, they were fighters, waiting for the right moment to prove their worth. And so, the story of the Verasai's unexpected rise began, not just as a tale of survival, but as a story of transformation, a reminder that strength doesn't always look the way we expect. As humanity watched, the question remained: could the Verasai become warriors, or were they doomed to remain the weakest of all species? That question would not remain unanswered for long. Months passed since the Verasai had first arrived on Earth. The fragile beings, once thought to be nothing more than a burden, were slowly beginning to show signs of change. Though they still struggled with the physical toll of their previous existence, something within them was shifting. Humanity had extended a hand, not just in aid but in belief that the weakest of the galaxy could find strength, that even the most fragile species could rise from the ashes of despair. Dr. Alara Tain had been at the forefront of the Verasai project from the beginning. She had witnessed their slow progress with a mixture of cautious optimism and quiet awe. Still, even she couldn't have predicted what was to come. The transformation began in the most unexpected of places, the training facilities. Originally, these facilities had been designed for Earth's own defense initiatives, a place where soldiers were taught hand-to-hand combat, survival tactics, and strategies for warfare. The Verasai had been kept away from these areas, their fragility too much of a concern for human officials. But Dr. Tain insisted that the Verasai be given the opportunity to observe, to learn, and to test their own limits. What she saw one fateful morning took her breath away. In the corner of the training room, one of the Verasai, a figure who had once been barely able to lift their own arms, was sparring with one of Earth's elite soldiers. At first, the human soldier held back, unsure how to approach someone so physically weak. But as the fight progressed, something began to change. The Verasai, who had struggled to walk a mere few months ago, was adapting. Their movements became swift, precise, and surprisingly powerful. With every move, they grew faster, more agile. The soldier, who had once been confident in their superior strength, was suddenly struggling to keep up. The Verasai didn't rely on brute force. Instead, they used their intelligence, analyzing their opponent's moves and countering with efficiency and precision. It was a style of combat unlike anything the humans had ever seen, a mix of agility, strategy, and raw determination. Within minutes, the human soldier was on the ground, breathless, unable to continue. The Verasai stood above them, not in triumph but in quiet realization. This was just the beginning. Dr. Tain rushed into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She could barely believe her eyes. "What? How did you?" The Verasai, who had once been so frail, looked at her with a calm, almost knowing expression. "We remember, more than we realize." It was as if a dormant part of their past had awakened, something ancient, something buried deep within them. The Verasai were not just survivors of their world, they were a species built for something far greater. For years, they had been oppressed, mocked, and reduced to nothing more than the weakest link in the galaxy. But now, on Earth, they were finding their strength. The question no longer was whether they could survive. The question was, what would they become? Word of this display spread quickly. The Verasai were no longer seen as helpless beings in need of constant protection. They were becoming warriors, fighters who could not only defend themselves but take on the galaxy itself. The humans who had once doubted their potential were now watching in disbelief as the Verasai transformed right before their eyes. But the transformation wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. The Verasai began to heal, not just from their physical injuries but from the deep scars left by their violent past. They formed bonds with their human caretakers, creating friendships that transcended species. Where there had once been a divide, an impenetrable wall between them and their saviors, now there was understanding, respect, and a shared desire to thrive. Yet not everyone was convinced. While the Verasai were gaining strength, there were still many who doubted their true potential. Some humans, still fearful of what the Veraci could become, argued that their sudden rise in combat prowess was too dangerous. Earth's leaders debated what to do with the Veraci. Should they continue to train them? Should they be integrated into Earth's defense forces, or would their newfound abilities pose a threat? Dr. Tane found herself torn between hope and fear. She had witnessed the Veraci's growth firsthand, but she understood the danger of pushing them too far, too fast. She feared that if they were pushed too hard, they might revert to the desperation they had once known, or worse, become tools for others to exploit. But something inside her told her that the Veraci weren't just survivors, they were fighters. They had endured too much, faced too many impossible odds, and overcome so much, that they could no longer be seen as weak. The time had come to test their limits, and she would be there, standing beside them, every step of the way. In a quiet moment with one of the Veraci, she asked, "What do you want from all of this? What do you seek now?" The Veraci's response was simple, but it carried the weight of their entire species' journey. "We want to protect. To stand tall. To be strong. To fight for a future we never thought possible." Dr. Tane nodded, knowing in her heart that the path ahead would be dangerous. But it was a path they would walk together. And, for the first time, it felt like humanity wasn't the only species with hope on its side. With the Veraci's stunning display of skill and intelligence in the training rooms, it was only a matter of time before Earth's military leaders decided to test their abilities in the field. But the question remained, could they truly be trusted? Or were they, in fact, just an unpredictable force waiting to be unleashed? The first real mission for the Veraci came sooner than expected. A rogue faction, known as the Haxari, had been spotted near the outer edge of Earth's territories, raiding ships and causing unrest in neighboring systems. Earth's defense forces were stretched thin, and there was no clear plan for dealing with the threat. The Haxari were a brutal, ruthless species, known for their overwhelming strength and devastating combat tactics. They were unlike anything Earth had ever faced. And now, with the Veraci emerging as a potential ally, the question on everyone's mind was simple: would the Veraci help humanity, or would they prove to be more dangerous than the enemy? Dr. Tane had her reservations. She knew the Veraci weren't ready to face such a deadly force, but she also understood that this mission could be their chance to prove themselves, not only to the humans but to themselves. The stakes were higher than ever. In the days leading up to the mission, the Veraci trained harder than ever before. They weren't just learning how to fight, they were learning how to trust each other, how to work as a unit. No longer were they isolated individuals struggling to survive, they were becoming a cohesive, powerful force, capable of taking on even the most terrifying threats. Elara watched them from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. These were no longer the weak, fragile creatures she had once cared for. They were becoming something more. She had witnessed their growth firsthand, each of them had overcome their own personal struggles, pushing past the limits that had once defined them. But as the mission grew closer, a nagging fear gnawed at her. What if they weren't ready? What if, despite all their progress, they weren't strong enough to stand up to the Haxari? She knew that the Veraci had learned to fight, but there was so much more to being a warrior than brute strength. It was about strategy, about thinking on your feet, and, most of all, it was about trust. Trust in each other, in their allies, and in the belief that they could win, even when the odds seemed impossible. The day of the mission arrived, and the Veraci stood before the humans who had once doubted them. Their leader, an imposing figure who had once struggled to lift even a single weapon, now stood tall, fully equipped with the armor and gear of a true soldier. The transformation was evident. Elara stepped forward, her voice firm but kind. "You've all come so far. You've proven you can fight. Now, it's time to show the galaxy who you truly are." The Veraci nodded, their faces set with determination. They knew the risks, but they also understood that this was their moment. If they succeeded, they would not only secure their place in history, they would secure their future. The journey to the Haxari stronghold was tense. The Varasai sat in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. It was hard to ignore the weight of the mission, the pressure of being the galaxy's last line of defense. There was no turning back now. As the Varasai and the human forces neared the Haxari base, they encountered heavy resistance. The Haxari ships had already engaged their defenses, and the Varasai felt the weight of their training being put to the test. They fought alongside the humans, coordinating their attacks with precision. The humans were surprised at how seamlessly the Varasai integrated into the battlefield, their movements fluid and decisive. But then, something unexpected happened. The Varasai, in the heat of battle, began to push ahead, their instincts taking over. They fought with a ferocity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. They no longer seemed like the fragile beings that had once arrived on Earth. They were fierce, unstoppable forces, tearing through Haxari lines with unmatched speed and power. As the battle raged on, the humans were left in shock. The Varasai, it seemed, had unlocked something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. But in that very moment, Dr. Tane realized that it was not just raw power that made them unstoppable, it was their resilience, their unwavering determination. The Varasai didn't fight to conquer, they fought to protect, to defend everything they had learned to love. When the final Haxari warrior fell, the battlefield fell silent. The humans stared in disbelief at what had just occurred. The Varasai had done it. They had not only defeated the Haxari, they had proven that they were not to be underestimated. But as the dust settled, Dr. Tane couldn't shake the unease that lingered in her heart. The Varasai were powerful, yes, but they had also become something else, a force that no one, not even humanity, could fully control. The victory was bittersweet. The Varasai had shown the galaxy their potential, but in doing so, they had set a new course for themselves, one that would be shaped by the very strength they had once lacked. As they returned to Earth, the Varasai stood tall, no longer the weak, fragile creatures they had once been. They were warriors now, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The victory against the Haxari was swift, but it came with consequences no one could have foreseen. While the Varasai were celebrated as heroes, their newfound power, and their unpredictable nature, began to stir fear and suspicion across the galaxy. Dr. Tane, though proud of the Varasai's achievements, found herself at the center of an emerging storm. Earth's leadership had always seen the Varasai as a potential asset, but the battle with the Haxari had exposed a darker side of their transformation. In private meetings, military leaders and politicians alike began to question whether they had truly harnessed the Varasai's power, or whether it was now controlling them. The Varasai had always been subservient to humans, taught to obey and respect the laws of Earth. But in the wake of their battle with the Haxari, their confidence was growing. They were no longer content to be mere tools of war. They had tasted power and victory, and they were beginning to see themselves as more than the fragile beings they once were. As weeks passed, tensions mounted. The Varasai were no longer simply soldiers, they were becoming independent thinkers, questioning their place in the universe. Elara watched this shift unfold with a sense of both awe and apprehension. She had always known the Varasai were capable of greatness, but now she could see the seeds of something far more complex, a desire for autonomy, a longing to control their own destiny. It wasn't long before the first signs of rebellion appeared. A group of Varasai, led by their strongest warrior, Alor, began to speak openly about their dissatisfaction with Earth's leadership. They felt that humanity had used them as tools, manipulating them for their own gain. They had earned the right to decide their own future, to chart their own course, free from the control of the humans who had once saved them. Alor's words struck a chord with many of the Varasai. They had always known they were different, weaker than other species in the galaxy, but now they had proven they were capable of so much more. Why should they remain under human authority, when they were now powerful enough to stand on their own? Elara knew that Alor's group was dangerous. His charisma and strength were undeniable, and he was stirring a movement among the Veraci that could unravel everything they had worked for. The peace they had fought so hard to establish was hanging by a thread. Dr. Tane, meanwhile, was caught between loyalty to the Veraci and her responsibility to humanity. She knew that the Veraci had a right to independence, but she also understood the consequences of their sudden rise to power. If the Veraci were allowed to go unchecked, their rebellion could ignite a war that would tear the galaxy apart. And there were darker forces watching from the shadows. Word of the Veraci's newfound strength had spread, and it wasn't just Earth's leaders who were taking note. Other species, many of them hostile, were starting to make their move. The first sign came from the Orcs, a species known for their brutal conquests and absolute disdain for other life forms. They had been watching the Veraci's rise with growing concern, and they decided it was time to strike before the Veraci became a threat they couldn't control. The Orcs fleet appeared in Earth's orbit one evening, a dark shadow that blocked out the stars. The Veraci, still reeling from their victory against the Haxari, were now faced with a threat they hadn't anticipated, an entire species of conquerors, bent on destroying them before they could rise to power. The Orcs were ruthless, their tactics designed to obliterate their enemies without mercy. But the Veraci, having tasted battle, were no longer the timid creatures they had once been. They rallied together under Orcs' leadership, determined to prove that they had not only the strength to fight, but the will to win. The battle that ensued was one of chaos and destruction. The Veraci, united and emboldened, fought with a ferocity that stunned even the Orcs. But as the battle raged on, something unexpected happened. Alor, in the heat of combat, made a critical decision. He ordered his forces to retreat, pulling back from the front lines to regroup. It was a calculated move, one that could turn the tide of the battle in their favor. But it also sent a powerful message to the humans: the Veraci were not afraid to make their own choices, regardless of what the humans or anyone else thought. The Orcs, sensing an opening, pressed forward, their weapons raining down on the Veraci ships. But as the battle reached its climax, Elara made a decision of her own. She ordered Earth's fleet to provide backup to the Veraci, sending reinforcements to push back the Orcs invaders. It was a bold move, and one that would determine the fate of their fragile alliance. The reinforcements arrived just in time. With Earth's help, the Veraci were able to fight back the Orcs, forcing them into retreat. But the victory was bittersweet. The Veraci had proven their strength once again, but the cost of their independence had become clear. The humans could no longer control them, and the galaxy would have to reckon with the new power that had been born. As the dust settled, Elara couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The Veraci had won the battle, but the war for their freedom was just beginning. Would they fight for their independence, or would they continue to follow the humans who had brought them into the galaxy's struggle? The Veraci were no longer the weak species they once were. They had become a force to be reckoned with, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The battle with the Orcs had been won, but the galaxy was no longer the same. What had begun as a war of survival for the Veraci had transformed into a war for their very identity and future. They had proven their strength, their courage, and their ability to fight, but now, the question that weighed on everyone's mind was, what happens next? Elara watched the aftermath of the battle with a heavy heart. Earth had sent reinforcements, but the cost had been high. The Orcs were gone for now, but the Veraci had grown stronger, more unpredictable. Alor's leadership had driven them to victory, but in the process, the Veraci had forged their own path, one that no longer relied on human control. The immediate aftermath of the battle had given the Veraci a sense of pride. They had stood together against a powerful enemy, and they had emerged victorious. But there was a growing unrest among them, a feeling that their victory had only come because the humans had fought alongside them. There was a whisper among the Veraci that Earth had only helped out of necessity, not out of genuine loyalty. The humans were no longer seen as their protectors, but rather as a reminder of their weakness, a weakness that they no longer wanted to acknowledge. Elara was aware of this shift. As a scientist and a leader, she had always hoped the Verasai would find their place in the galaxy. But now, she was faced with the reality that their place might no longer be beside humans. They were carving out their own destiny, and that could mean they would no longer need her or the humans who had helped them. The Verasai, however, were not the only ones grappling with uncertainty. Earth's political landscape was shifting. The alliance between humans and Verasai had been seen as a success at first, but after the Orcali battle, there were growing voices within Earth's government who saw the Verasai's strength as a threat. The fear of a possible Verasai rebellion, fueled by their newfound independence, was spreading like wildfire. There were whispers of military action, plans to contain the Verasai before they could fully break free from human influence. The leaders of Earth had invested too much in the Verasai to let them slip from their grasp now, especially given their potential as a powerful ally, or a devastating enemy. But there were others, including Elara, who still believed in the promise of unity between the two species. She had witnessed the Verasai's transformation with her own eyes and knew that they were capable of something more than mere soldiers. They had become a symbol of resilience, strength, and the power of second chances. If they could continue to work together, humanity and the Verasai could reshape the future of the galaxy. But she knew that it wouldn't be easy. The tension between the two species was palpable, and trust, once established, was now slipping away. In the midst of this tension, Allor emerged as the true face of the Verasai movement. His charisma and leadership were undeniable. He spoke passionately about the Verasai's right to decide their own future, free from human oversight. His speeches were filled with hope and pride, and the Verasai flocked to him. He was their leader now, not Elara, and he was intent on securing their future as a free and independent species. Yet, Allor's vision for the future was not one of peace. He spoke of war, not just against the Orcali, but against anyone who would stand in the way of the Verasai's independence. Earth, despite the aid they had provided, was quickly becoming an enemy in Allor's eyes. He saw their alliance as a prison, not a partnership. The humans had helped them, yes, but they had done so out of necessity, not friendship. To Allor, that was unacceptable. He had begun to make alliances with other races, ones that had long been oppressed by humanity's dominance. The Verasai, once weak and broken, were now becoming a rallying point for those who had suffered under human rule. This coalition was growing, and it was becoming clear that a war was on the horizon, one that would determine the fate of the galaxy. As the months went on, the tension reached a boiling point. On Earth, the decision was made, a preemptive strike against the Verasai, to ensure they could not grow beyond control. The military was mobilized, ships were readied, and Elara found herself caught in the middle of a conflict she had never imagined. The Verasai, her beloved Verasai, were now the enemy. Elara couldn't accept this. She had spent years helping the Verasai. She had seen their potential, their struggle, and their growth. How had things gone so wrong? How had the delicate balance between the two species dissolved into outright war? But war was inevitable. The Verasai were no longer just a tool of Earth, they were a force in their own right, with their own ambitions and desires. The galaxy had changed. The question wasn't if a war would come, but when. As Elara sat in her quarters, watching the news feeds about the preparations for conflict, she knew that the Verasai could never go back to the way things were. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. They had become warriors, unstoppable, powerful, and capable of changing the course of history. But at what cost? The answer was becoming painfully clear: the galaxy was no longer a place of peace. It had become a battleground, one where freedom and power would be determined by who could win the next battle. And as Elara prepared for what was to come, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Verasai were not just fighting for their independence, but for something much greater. The future of the galaxy itself would be decided by the choices they made now. The final confrontation was coming. And it would change everything. As the tensions between the Verasai and Earth escalated to the brink of open conflict, Ilara found herself in a place she never thought she would be, on the opposing side of her own people. The Verasai, once fragile and fearful, were now more than capable of standing on their own. Allor, their charismatic and passionate leader, had transformed them into a powerful military force, one that could challenge even the might of Earth. Yet, Ilara couldn't bring herself to view her own people as the enemy. She had worked too hard, and loved them too much, to stand idly by while a war that could destroy everything they had worked for unfolded. She had spent years on Verasai, understanding their struggles, their history, their pain. She knew that the Verasai had been exploited, that they had been used as pawns in humanity's vast, unforgiving chessboard. But they had grown, changed, and found a place for themselves in the galaxy. They no longer needed Earth to define who they were. Ilara's loyalty to the Verasai was unwavering, but so was her loyalty to Earth. She understood the fear of the humans, the uncertainty they felt in the face of the Verasai's newfound strength. She knew that Earth's leadership feared what the Verasai might become, a force that could one day challenge human authority in the galaxy. But she also knew that the two species had a shared history, one that could not be erased so easily. It wasn't just about military might or dominance, it was about the future. The future of the galaxy, and the future of her people. There had to be another way. She couldn't accept that the only solution was war. As she sought out a way to prevent the conflict, Ilara was drawn into an unlikely alliance. There were factions within Earth's government who were reluctant to go to war with the Verasai. They believed in diplomacy, in the possibility of finding common ground. Some of them even believed that the Verasai could be a force for peace in the galaxy, rather than a threat to it. Ilara met with these individuals in secret, a small group of high-ranking officials who were willing to entertain the idea of peace. They shared her belief that humanity could find a way to coexist with the Verasai, and that war would only serve to destroy everything they had worked toward. But they were also cautious. They knew that Allor's movement had gained too much momentum, that the Verasai's thirst for independence could not be easily quelled. The question was, how could they stop a war that seemed destined to happen? Ilara knew the answer. She would have to go to Allor himself. The task was daunting. Allor had become a powerful leader, and his loyalty to his people was absolute. He had fought for their freedom, for their dignity, and now, he was ready to fight for their independence at any cost. To approach him would be to risk everything she had worked for, but it was the only way. Ilara knew she had to try, even if it meant betraying the very people who had once considered her an ally. Allor was not an easy man to find. He had retreated into the heart of Verasai-controlled space, surrounded by his closest confidants and military leaders. He had become a figurehead, the embodiment of the Verasai's rise to power. His presence loomed large in the galaxy, and his followers were unwavering in their support of his vision. Ilara knew that convincing him to abandon his vision of a Verasai-led galaxy would be no simple task. But she had to try. With the support of her Earth allies, Ilara set off on a dangerous journey to meet with Allor. Her ship cut through the cold darkness of space, carrying her toward a destiny she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Along the way, she reflected on everything she had lost, and everything she stood to lose. The Verasai, the humans, the galaxy itself, everything was hanging in the balance. When she arrived in Verasai space, the tension in the air was palpable. Allor's forces had grown in strength, and they watched her ship carefully, knowing that she was an emissary from Earth. She was escorted to his stronghold, a sprawling city that had been built in the wake of the Verasai's newfound power. It was both beautiful and intimidating, a symbol of the Verasai's resilience and determination. As she walked into Allor's presence, she was struck by the fire in his eyes. He was not the same broken creature she had first encountered on Verasai all those years ago. He was a leader now, powerful and resolute. His strength radiated from him like an aura, and it was clear that he no longer saw humanity as a partner, but as a potential threat. Elara, Allor greeted her with a nod. I did not expect to see you again. Not after everything. Elara swallowed her nerves and forced herself to stand tall. I came to speak with you, Allor. I came to stop this war. Allor's expression hardened. You have come to stop me? To stop my people from achieving what we have always deserved? No, Elara said softly. I've come to stop us all from destroying each other. I've come to remind you that we're not enemies. We can find a way forward, together. He looked at her, his gaze piercing. You think humanity will ever accept us as equals? You think they will ever truly see us for who we are, not what they made us to be? Elara hesitated. I believe they can. But only if you give them a chance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their history hung between them like an invisible barrier, one that neither could fully understand or erase. But in that silence, something shifted. Something deep inside Allor seemed to change, as if he was beginning to reconsider. I will not turn my back on my people, he said, finally breaking the silence. But perhaps, there is another way. Perhaps I can help you stop this war. Elara's heart raced. You'll help me?